at that time, I honestly thought that the notion of an afterlife was like a premise of a Jack Benny movie was my main associate. I thought it was like something people imagined and to make a comedy or a cartoon. And I didn't realize anybody took it seriously.
Today's guest is Dr. Raymond Moody. Dr. Moody is renowned in the near-death experience, NDE, research world.
I began to go the rounds of these, and every one of them, oh, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but and so I, well, and these near-death experiences. And so I wrote a book about this when I was still in medical school. And it was published when I was still in medical school, actually. But then 2 months later, I graduated from medical school. And that's how this kind of came about.
Actually known for coining the phrase near-death experience.
Everybody says no matter how brilliant they are, how many languages they speak, whatever, they say there are no words for this, that this is beyond words. But in terms of the best they can come up with a description, as they say, they go through this tunnel and they come out on the other side into an incredibly brilliant light of the land. Or, 1915, somebody says, I watched a movie on my phone this morning. Well, now it's so unintelligibility is a drifting thing. And to be intellectually honest, you have to acknowledge that the notion of an afterlife in 2025 is unintelligible nonsense, but that's okay. In science, nonsense is a placeholder.
He really is kind of the original near-death experience researcher, and without him, we wouldn't even have that name for it. I'm very excited to speak with basically this legend in the field today. And now for my conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody.
Hey everyone!
I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. I'm speaking with Dr. Raymond Moody. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's kind of one of the classics in the near-death experience research. So welcome, Dr. Moody.
Thank you so much for having me on your program, and to the folks listening in. We just thank you so much for listening to us.
Well, thank you for coming on. I know I just read your bio, but I'd love to hear a bit about your history. What was your background, and how did you get into writing your first near-death experience book?
Well, I had a great experience being from Porterdale, Georgia, a tiny town in the South, of not being exposed to religion because my dad was kind of a military officer and surgeon, and who had been in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And I gather, as I look back at it, probably hostile to religion that he had when I was a kid was probably because of the things he had seen. But I grew up captivated by astronomy and, the incomprehensibility of the universe, like that it can't end in a wall because there's got to be something on the other side of a wall, but it can't go on and on forever either. So neither option makes sense. So about that time, I was in love with the works of Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss. Actually, this was long before The Cat in the Hat, which was a disappointment to me. But anyway, in that mindset, interested in things that don't make sense, like the universe. So I went to the University of Virginia at the age of 18 to study astronomy, but I fell immediately into philosophy, took a philosophy course, and was from that moment forward, I was a philosophy major. And what hooked me was Plato's Republic, which is about a near death experience. And this whole dialogue culminates in this astonishing story of a man, who was believed dead on the battlefield and got out of his body and went through a passageway into another world where his life was reviewed. And so I remember at that time, I honestly thought that the notion of an afterlife was like a premise of a Jack Benny movie was my main associate. I thought it was like something people imagined to make a comedy or a cartoon. And I didn't realize anybody took it seriously but when Plato made it obvious that he thought this was the most important question, I was kind of got to thinking about it. And then found out that Plato and other Greek philosophers knew cases of people who were apparently dead but revived and who told these stories. And so basically that was what I knew in 1962, September. And flash forward to February of 1965, I met a man there in Charlottesville, Virginia, Dr. George Ritchie, who had had such an experience himself at the age of 20 in Camp Barkley, Texas, when he was a recruit in the Army and developed double lobar pneumonia and was pronounced dead for at least 9 minutes. They don't know how long before they found him. But anyway, George had this phenomenal experience, and hearing it as a student from Porterdale, Georgia, and Charlottesville, Virginia, in 1965 from Dr. George Ritchie, to whom it occurred in Camp Barkley, Texas in 1943. And even though he was from Richmond, Virginia, I found out from my father after my book, Life After Life, was published in 1975, that I was there, that my dad had been there, went to Camp Barkley early in September from Porterdale, and my mom too. And so that dad could go to Officers Candidate School. George's experience, I was conceived late September. George's experience was the 20th, about my mom and dad moved away from Camp Barkley on December 29th. So I was there in utero when this experience took place, changed my life and many other lives. So anyway, I began to follow these. I got a PhD in philosophy at University of Virginia. I believe I was the age of 23 years old, which now I think, oh my God, there's something very wrong with somebody who would get a PhD in philosophy at age 23 and then go on a few years later, after teaching philosophy for 3 years, to get an MD degree at the age of 31. And so, I understand now that that's just something terribly wrong with that, which was, my nose was in the book all the time. But anyway, throughout this, I kept, the years when I was a philosophy professor, I heard this repeatedly from my students and also members of the faculty, and began to hear it when I was invited to lecture on this subject by civic clubs, which were then an exclusively male province back in the 70s. And it was the movers and shakers in town, mostly men, all men, who would sit there, and they needed a speaker every whatever week for 20 minutes. And I began to go the rounds of these, and every one of them, oh, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but and so I quickly realized that due to the advent of CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, what was always occurred, but was an extremely rare event, suddenly, just in a matter of years, was transformed into a fairly common event. And these near-death experiences. And so I wrote a book about this when I was still in medical school. And it was published when I was still in medical school, actually. But then 2 months later, I graduated from medical school. And that's how this kind of came about. But it was not something that I sought out. And I realized fully the great logical difficulties that exist in making sense of this. But what we do know is that people from all over the world tell us this similar story, that they say that they, at this point where their heart stops beating, or they hear the doctor say, "Oh my God, he's dead," or words to that effect, they say that they find themselves out of their body and viewing the scene of the resuscitation from above. And they say it's not that they hear what the doctors and nurses are saying, because it's no auditory, but they become aware of what the doctors and nurses are thinking. And that they realize at some point that this is something to do with death. So at this point, they say they pass through what they call a tunnel. Everybody says, no matter how brilliant they are, how many languages they speak, whatever, they say, there are no words for this, that this is beyond words. But in terms of the best they can come up with a description, they say they go through this tunnel and they come out on the other side into an incredibly brilliant light. And people say things like, I could say light or I could say love. Doesn't matter which is this beyond words. But you find yourself in this comforting light. People say that they encounter relatives or friends of theirs who've already died. Not in bodily form, but people say that you recognize the person by the memories and the presence, but that there is a form too, but it's not physical. They say but they say at some point that the rest of this kind of disappears and they find themselves surrounded. Time stands still. There's no more time. And they say they're surrounded by everything they've ever done in a kind of panorama. And they witness every event in their life. But when they witness it, they say you don't relive it from the point of view you had when you did it, not solely. You remember your point of view, but also you are empathically identified with the person with whom you did it, to whom you did it. And so you feel the feelings of hurt if you've done something unkind, or the nice feelings if you've done a kind thing to person. So everybody comes out of this, with the basic same lesson, which is that what this is all about is love. And they say very often there's a being of light, a presence of complete compassion, who kind of reviews this panorama with you and makes comments. But they say it's not in words, because this is beyond words, but the thoughts come. And the thought is, how have you learned to love? Is one way of putting it. But also people say this presence seems to be fascinated by or interested in scenes in which you've been learning something. People say that this being kind of focuses in, and the thought comes, which I've heard from many people, but I remember George Ritchie's words ring in my mind, that he said this being was interested in scenes in which he had been learning something. And the comment came is very interesting. And George's remark was that this process of knowledge, I gather, is something that goes on quite literally for eternity, that you don't stop learning. So that's what people come back with. At some point, they have to come back here. And how do they get back? Some people say, I have no idea why I was in this life, and then zap back in my body with no sense of transition. Other people say that they're met by, you got to go back. It's not your time. And they're not told why that they have to finish something, but they get the sense that they need to finish something. And then a third group was given a choice, and, yeah, and not surprising. Well, once up to those who were given a choice, chose to come back, and most often, I would say practically universally, it's on behalf of somebody else. But most commonly in that group, it's young children. They say, for myself, I'd rather stay in that light. But I chose to come back because I had young children left to raise, as a mantra almost I've heard from, which I can well understand. Although my kids are 27 and 25 now, I still feel like I need to raise them, right? But they're delightfully in my part at home. Thank you, God. And which is the okay thing lately is, that generation are staying at home, which I'm very
Yeah.
familiar with from childhood because that's how it was done. When I was a kid, when one of my grandmom's children would marry, they would typically bring their spouse home for a while to,
Really? There's something
yeah.
really nice about that,
Well, there is, Dan. You're too young to remember it, but at 81, that was the way it was done. For one thing, with a lot of the guys away at World War II, people were getting their, you know, feet back on the ground after the war, kind
Well, now, about near-death experiences, there's a thought that it's just hallucinations and your
of. Yeah.
brain, dealing with the trauma and fear of dying. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that um, the difficulty with that is multiple difficulties. Philosophical are the ones that get me the most, which is that they relate to what we call in philosophy the mind body problem. Like in reality, it's a riddle as to how the consciousness is associated with the body, and there's various theories. And the ones that the neuroscience kind of takes on unreflectively is called epiphenomenalism, which is the theory that there is no independent reality to consciousness, that consciousness is a kind of secondary byproduct of what they regard as the reality, which is biochemical and electrochemical reactions in the brain substance. But anyway, it's a philosophical problem, which is, and I come down decidedly on another position myself, which is which was pointed out by Bishop Berkeley, very great in the 17th century, pointed out that really, I mean, you can't infer from your sense experience that there's an external reality. I mean, I guess only a philosopher can appreciate that, but I do. But the more practical difficulty with it is that um, bystanders at the bedside of somebody else who is dying, and the bystanders themselves not ill or injured, will very commonly report all of the elements that we think of as a near-death experience. But there's nothing untoward physiologically is happening to them. But by being in the presence of somebody who is dying, people very commonly undergo those same things. People tell me, for example, that as grandma died, I myself lifted out of my body. I started going upward with her toward this light. Then at a certain point, I came back down. People say they see apparitions of the dying person's deceased loved ones coming into the room as though to take them away. People say the room fills with light, or a thing I witnessed myself when my mother died. How you find yourself in some non-three-dimensional geometry. The room changes conformation. You see things at impossible angles and such. And most remarkably, I have quite a number of cases of bystanders who empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who died. But these kinds of difficulties don't really get through to people who are already in the grips of epiphenomenalism. But in real terms, and the kind of experiences that people have in their real lives and connection with death and dying, shared death experiences are a very common kind of thing. And so, and since they are the same kind of thing as near death experience, I say that we're dealing with something here that is beyond the power of epiphenomenalism to deal with. But that can't interfere with their, because there's a great deal of value in neurosciences, right? So these folks can't be dismissed because their philosophical thinking is a little off, because they're doing valuable things anyway.
Right. Now, is there a shared death experience and a near death experience that just blew you away? What would you say of each of those are the most remarkable ones you've heard of?
Well, I've just heard so many, and I hear them all the time. And
Right.
and naturally, ones that are kind of markers, is like one a few years ago is one that I heard from two people who were involved in it. One was Jeffrey Olson, who was a graphic artist and dresses the part. I remember when I was a philosophy professor, at the first of the year, the different tables of professors used to stand up to introduce themselves, but they sat together. The physics professors would stand up kind of draggly here and there, glasses on crooked, and then the business people department would stand up in their suits, and then the English professors would stand up with the patches on their sleeves and the hair. And then the fine arts people would just kind of swoop up together, every here in place. And that's Jeffrey, right? So he's a fine artist, like an art, and so just a wonderful, sweet guy. And the
Yeah.
other guy is Jeffrey O'Driscoll, who is a emergency room physician. But some years ago, Jeff Olson had a horrific car crash and a near-death experience along with it. And his leg was smashed off during the accident, and his wife was killed, and one of his children were killed. But he, in the hospital room where Jeffrey Olson was surrounded by the tubes and wires, Jeffrey O'Driscoll had a conversation with Jeffrey Olson's deceased wife, and so did the nurse and the and this is. But I have heard equivalent things, but at a certain point, I just kind of gave up. And what I gather is that there's an afterlife, and much more importantly than Raymond Moody's opinion is that I think that we really are in a situation where we can begin to contemplate a genuine, rational proof of an afterlife. I say it for sure. We are, yeah. But also, it's not going to go over well with the establishment. It's
Why? Wait,
yeah.
actually, why do you think that is? Why would the establishment not love this?
And because, by the way, and this is nothing personal, and these are the things that I say to my parapsychological friends when we're together. Okay, so it's nothing personal, but I just don't buy it that in 2025 that the question of an afterlife is scientific. I think that the real objections, which are preserved for us very well in the Western intellectual tradition, is through by Alcmaeon and Pythagoras and Democritus and Plato, that those ideas of Plato and the Phaedo were taken up by the Christian church. They didn't have much to go on in the Jewish or Christian scriptures, so they had to import because they needed something to say about the afterlife. So they took Plato's Phaedo. A lot of them will, they don't want to hear that these days, but that's the reality. Which, if you want to find that out, you can by asking professors of religious studies, for example. But uh, that is how, and then it got up to Hume where things loosened up a little bit. And David Hume pointed out that the question of an afterlife, though it is very powerful emotionally, is incommensurable with logic as we have it. He said, and this is, plain as day when you know the logic. But basically, he said that by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, he said, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And that is the reality. Okay, that's the real difficulty. And so what we have of parapsychology and psychical research today, and their associated so-called skeptic movement, which is absolutely baloney, because those people who characterize themselves as skeptics by what they say show that they have no idea what skeptic means. And I like teaching Greek philosophy, right? And it's a demonstrable falsehood that these people who call themselves skeptics know anything about what skepticism is. But both of those movements are really the same movement. And what they're united by is scientism, which is they both under the delusion that this question of an afterlife is a scientific question. It's just not. But anyway, I move on by saying you can solve Hume's problem that we are really on the verge of real breakthroughs in rational thinking about the afterlife, but we got to reformat our minds to do it. Because parapsychology and psychical research didn't originate with the Western intellectual tradition. If you look at it in the real terms of what really happened historically, is that parapsychological research and parapsychology began in 1848 in upstate New York with two mischievous little girls cracking their toes surreptitiously under a blanket. That's the reality of what happened. And that started the craze for spiritualism.
That was the Fox sisters, right?
That's right. And God bless them. I mean, I committed a couple of adolescent pranks myself. If I hadn't gotten trapped into like that, I don't know what that would have done. But they handled it very gracefully. They finally, confessed they made it up. But then, the horror from the religion. So then they had to recant their confession. But out of all that came parapsychology. That's the reality. And so then back around the turn of the century, they had to sort of backtrack quickly because the classical model of education was very big then. So that I gather there's kind of a collective, there's not much to report on our side, before 1848. So they had to go on backtrack. And so these couple of ridiculous books written by nice people, it's like one was E.R. Dodds, who was a scholar at Oxford, who wrote The Greeks and the Irrational. And my professors encouraged me to read it when I was an undergraduate. But they also said, watch out, because he apparently was under the sway of spiritualism. So he falsely read the mediumship into some of the things in Greece. I mean, it's just to say that the prophetesses at Delphi were mediums just shows utter ignorance. But anyway, because it was a great thing. They were channeling Apollo by breathing in the fumes of ethylene gas, which emerged, and which I have to say, I tried it myself in medical school. I mean, the ethylene, and what it does is it makes you talk nonsense. And so what they were doing was they were talking nonsense, but the priest would write it into something. And that was what, but to call that mediumship, it's ridiculous. So anyway, mine say we got to correct ourselves. The rational thought on the afterlife went out of joint in with the parapsychology, but we can take it forward now from what the Greeks thought and make it work out so that we face the real problems. And so what I can say is we can reformat our mind. And Liz, it really is very simple. I mean, it really is. As long as you are open to think a new way, you can reformat your mind to think about life after death in an entirely new way. And once you do, it reformats your mind so that when subsequently you happen to have a near-death experience, you will be able to, you will have to talk about it in a whole new way. And so what does that mean? Well, that means, how do we know it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri? You ever thought about that? Like they can't send homing pigeons out with an odometer. So how did they figure that one out? Until about 1838, it was just everybody knew, quote, that it was impossible, that we would never know the distances to the fixed stars. That was just common sense. But by about 1838, they were realizing that they knew already that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. But the measurements were getting accurate enough so when the Earth was here, you could make a careful measurement of the angle to a nearby star. You would wait exactly 6 months later, measuring it again. You'll see there'd be a tiny difference if the star is up close. And that's called parallax. Now we have a method to do that with the afterlife, because we already have a lot of near-death experiences that are geared through the Aristotelian lens of logic, right? And so what that apparently makes it is a travel narrative. It's like, I got out of my body, I went through a tunnel into a light, and I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and came back to life. That's a travel narrative. But just a minute here. What they say is there's no time. Time stood still, and there's no space. I was not in space. And so there's no words for it. So just a minute here. What if those things are true, then a travel narrative makes no sense. But that's all right. When Lincoln was president, there was this big ceremony. It's very solemn. Everybody was gathered around. And Lincoln's part called for him to climb up on a horse, mount a horse, and to lead a procession away from the scene. And so when Lincoln did, the horse picked its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around, everybody shocked and embarrassed into silence for poor Mr. President. But Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody just melted in his laughter. And that's nonsense to say that a horse could get into its own back. Right? But nonetheless, it creates that very vivid image in your mind. Now, when somebody in a clear state of consciousness lapses into nonsense inadvertently, they can correct themselves. If the coach says, you guys pair up in threes, like, just a minute here, coach. Pair means two. He will presumably get it, right? And so he'll change. Okay. So now, somebody going into a near-death experience, knowing the things I've just talked to you about, is going to say, oh, okay, I see. I can't talk about it in the old way because I see why that's unintelligible. So they're going to shift it to another way. And that gives parallax. And guess what, Liz? It's already happened once that I know of. At probably other times, I've been teaching this a long time, but a while back, I got this call from a wonderful man who was a scientist and an esteemed sculptor at once, and just a nice guy besides. And very brilliant. He knew Bell of the Bell theorem, just incredible guy. And so he took a seminar that I gave on my new logic. Then subsequently, he developed H1N1, was in the hospital for 60 days, lost his leg to gangrene, had 3 cardiac arrests, and called me in his weakened state to describe his near-death experience during the resuscitation. But and this is such a long story, but to get to the gist of it, he said while he was over there, his mind went back to the seminar, and he said, and I realized that what you're saying is true. You can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world, to use his exact words, unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. In other words, we've got to learn how to think logically about things that are unintelligible to solve the afterlife problem. And it seems like it's impossible to do because a logic of nonsense or not, it seems self-contradictory, but no way. It's the reason why we can't think logically about unintelligibility has to do with a simple mistake in the transmission from Plato to Aristotle. Because Plato had figured out how to think about unintelligible things or nonsense and wrote a whole dialogue about it. He pointed out that nonsense is funny, Dr. Seuss, right? In the places I go, there are things that I see that I never could spell if I stopped with the Z. I'm telling you this because you're one of my friends. My alphabet starts where your alphabet ends, right? And so, it's funny. And Plato pointed out that one thing can be more unintelligible than some other thing. Plato pointed out that even though it doesn't make sense, even though it's unintelligible, it creates a flow of ideation in your mind. He pointed out that it has a structure, but Aristotle was obsessional and he let all this go. So when he was just really mixed, that was a step too far from him. So he did not incorporate how to think logically about when things are unintelligible, because that was just too much for him. And because of that, when we come up with something that is unintelligible, then our minds just don't compute it logically. But it is an easy fix to correct that. The only barrier is psychological. In 2025, I guarantee you that the immediate obstacle that prevents a genuine breakthrough toward the rigorous rational investigation of the afterlife is entirely a psychological obstacle. It is no longer logical. Because wouldn't you agree from your common sense that the common sense attitude or that nonsense is something like a blank wall? I ask my students how to visualize it. They say it's like a blank wall and there's nothing on the other side of the wall except chaos. And that's the image people bring to it, right?
With nonsense.
Yeah, but that's totally wrong. And the reason they do it is a simple linguistic mistake, because nonsense has 2 meanings. One is a meaning of apodeosis, is a speech act, and that's with an exclamation point, like nonsense, and that's to reject something. But the noun nonsense is language that is unintelligible because it lacks meaning. And so that's what it means. And Dr. Seuss sold over 600 million books of nonsense. And who knows how many copies of Alice in Wonderland, right? But we can think logically about it. And once we do, our minds open up to many new possibilities of thinking about life after death and whole new ways of studying it, just like I mentioned. once we have a lot of other cases, see, we'll be able to compare how it seems with one logic, the Aristotelian, and then with the supplementary logic. So it hones us in on the afterlife.
Yeah, I remember at IANS you gave examples of things that would have been nonsense in the past and just how much as we acquire. Yeah, do you want to share do you want to share those? Because those kind of put it into perspective for me, you know?
Well, sure, yeah. If you think, go back in your mind to the year 1915, okay, and
1950.
immerse yourself in the mind of a well-informed, highly educated individual of the year 1915 in, say, United States or Europe. And now listen to the following three sentences. Sentence number one: all four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's unintelligible nonsense. Now add the knowledge of the role of DNA and heredity, gene splicing, gene editing, and cloning. And you've got an image of people going down to the wreckage and extracting the DNA, bringing it back up into cloning. And so now we got a picture that is intelligible. It hasn't happened yet that we know of, but it makes sense in a way that it couldn't in 1915. Or you open up the daily newspaper in 1915 and it says two women got married to each other in City Hall yesterday. Well, it must be a misprint. Right now it's the law of the land. Or, 1915, somebody says, I watched a movie on my phone this morning. Well, now it's so unintelligibility is a drifting thing. And to be intellectually honest, you have to acknowledge that the notion of an afterlife in 2025 is unintelligible nonsense, but that's okay. In science, nonsense is a placeholder. That wonderful professor of physics who is often on Discovery Channel with the wonderful long white hair, and he's a professor at some NYU or something, or maybe Manhattan. He's a professor of physics, and I forgot his name.
Bill Nye? Not Bill Nye, is it?
No, this is the Japanese American guy.
Oh, Michio Kaku?
Kaku, Dr. Kaku.
Dr. Michio
And
Kaku,
yeah,
yes.
one of his documentaries, he was saying that the two most powerful explanatory systems that have ever existed are the general relativity theory of Einstein and the quantum theory. And he said, but the difficulty is that when you integrate the equations, you get unintelligible nonsense. And that's what shows that nonsense is a placeholder. We know full well that it's nonsense, but we hold on to the nonsense in the anticipation that at some future time we'll have some breakthrough to make it make sense. And so it's not discouraging to me, but exciting that in 2025 the notion of an afterlife is unintelligible, because it's headed toward intelligibility. It's in those three examples I gave. The first one was due to scientific advanced knowledge in biology, DNA. The second one, the one of the marriage, changed because of change in the law. And the third one, the one on the phones, that changed due to technology. And it's interesting that the one that is going on now with the afterlife was not changed exactly by technology in the same way, but that it was made possible by technology, that the advent of CPR created a situation in which something that had always occurred and was well known to Plato and Democritus, but was extraordinarily rare, suddenly over just a few years becomes extraordinarily common. And what we are seeing, Liz, is we are seeing the afterlife is becoming infused with this life. because it's practically a statistical certainty that most people now, almost everybody assume, knows somebody who's been to the other side. And that means that there's a system of nodes on the planet of people who've had near death experiences, whose very vivid memories and feelings are still connected with the other side. So that is kind of infused, the afterlife is kind of infusing into this life. And I think a logic of how to think about things that are unintelligible is a necessary part of that integration. But see, it's
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened.
I have taught this literally since I was a philosophy professor. I've taught courses on how to think about the unintelligible. And so I've observed, a lot of people respond to this. And I've had a lot of students over the years come back to me after many years and say, hey, that what I taught was important to them, right? And one in the national security apparatus, for example. But the most response I've gotten from it over the years are from four categories of people. Number one is, and the most strong responders actually have been people in the commercial advertising business. And this first came to light some years ago in Colorado when I taught a course on unintelligibility on a Saturday. And the people there were from advertising. They went very enthused. And over the years, I've had a number of responses like that from people in advertising that my nonsense logic really helped them because advertising is about getting attention, right? Well, when I talk to you about the rumble on the Pingasar, where the Warbaso was last week, you're going to pay more attention to it, right?
Right. You think you misheard something.
Right,
You're like,
that's
what?
right.
I think with it now, I'm like, did I mishear?
Right. And
Yeah.
so they said that was the advantage to them. The second group were attorneys who said that they took this course to sharpen their critical thinking skills, which they're always into. And so then another group was the people in the literature department came to my lectures on nonsense for Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot, right? And Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear and Dr. Seuss. I mean, these are literary figures. And then the fourth group was intelligence folks, who are the nicest folks I've ever met in my life as a group. They really are. My image was James Bond, people jumping out of airplanes. No, this is more like, as Kant says in this, just lovely, lovely nerds. and they had me back several times to talk about this, and they're so inscrutable. Who knows what they're interested in? But they just have a way of, diffusing your curiosity. I don't know how they do it, but I'm encouraged by the fact that, they've followed up with me several times on this. So those indicators say that I'm onto something, but I don't think this is going to be received well by what I call the afterlife establishment, because what this is all about is the new book Swan Song shows that the presuppositions by which the afterlife establishment, parapsychology, and psychical research, and their alter egos, the so-called scientific skeptics, who are nothing of the sort, really, nothing to do with being a skeptic. But those groups are not going to respond well because it undermines or shows the fallacy of their assumptions. But what I hope to appeal is a whole new group of folks who really want to get interested in a serious, intellectually honest way about this question of an afterlife, and to be able to formulate it in a new way and to do research and from a whole different set of a whole different way of rationally comprehending this question, which has already borne fruit, but it will bear fruit a lot more in the future. Because I'm a recluse, right? I mean, but it's at some point this will catch on. I mean, I know one of the most brilliant scholars I've ever met in my life is already is bringing this forward. So anyway, this is the future of research into the afterlife, I say.
And I can't remember where I heard you talk about it once, but you talked about nonsense language as
Yeah,
people are dying, and that
yeah,
it's
right.
actually has patterns to it, or
That's
it's
right.
not as much nonsense as we think. So I'd love to hear about
That's
that.
right. That's right. When I went to medical school, I had already written about nonsense, and I lectured. I'd done courses on nonsense, right, and in my philosophy classes, and so I already understood that there's different types of nonsense. The whole notion of different types of nonsense strikes people as counterintuitive until they listen. Listen to this. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense, right? But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but it's recognizably a different pattern of nonsense than the first. And now listen to this one. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too, but yet a different one. Or here's another pattern. Hat thoroughly the if while zoom how zest. Or here's another one. Woman, they could one another, you want to make it da. There's a different, and it goes on forever. Okay. But because you always assume that nonsense is something unformed, that's what common sense says. People just don't make that connection. But as soon as you bring it to anybody's attention, oh yeah, I can distinguish among different types of nonsense. And you have the mental power to recognize categories. For example, if I put a new example into that mix, you can tell me which pattern it belongs to. And the example would be when you do this experiment, if you smell an odorless gas, it is carbon monoxide. That would be the third, right? The self-contradiction. And also my students find that very easily, once they learn these patterns, they can write their own original examples. And I've done this consistently over, is it 50 years now, I guess. And what students say when they do this is they write one type of nonsense, then they'll write shifting another, then another. And what people say as they shift from writing one type of nonsense to writing another, they can actually feel wheels turning in their head that they didn't even know were in there. And that you become aware as you're doing these exercises that you have mental faculties that you didn't know you had. And so that really goes back to what David Hume said, that what is needed is some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Well, one principle of nonsense logic is that there's many different types of nonsense, as we just saw, but we could go on for another day and show different types. But that's one principle, and when you learn that principle, it opens a faculty of your mind you didn't know you had. So when you put all these together and you send people over there who know this logic when they subsequently have a near-death experience, they're going to talk about it in a whole new way, and it's already happened. And so we, in the future, we will have a different way, or maybe variety of different ways to talk about it, and that take it outside of the framework of a travel narrative, but into what I don't know. But that's what, that's a very interesting question to me. But once we know that, see, we'll have a case of comparison. We'll be able to look at the afterlife through two different logical lenses.
Yeah. And you even like it's fascinating when you think about language in general. And so if you're sometimes can't tell is someone could be speaking nonsense or another language, like another language is perceived as nonsense to you until you learn
and when
that
people
language.
Are on their deathbed, they lapse into nonsense. And once you recognize it, see, you can, as I recognized with my patients when I started, that people who are delirious talk one type of nonsense. People are schizophrenic talk a different type. And different types of illnesses cause people to talk different types of nonsense. And as people are on the bedside, they talk nonsense. And it's and something I've heard from a number of people in such a way that, from the way they told me, I just see that, they really experienced something. Like one woman who I'd actually known before, she was a professor of religious studies, and her husband was a professor of philosophy, and they taught at the same university. And I met them in 1977, had a wonderful conversation with them when I lectured at their university. And then some years later, I mean, this was back in the 2000s, early, maybe 2010, something like that. She called me, and I subsequently went and a few months before lectured at that university, and she called me and she said that when her husband was dying, she wrote it down, because she said, and even when she was transcribing it, she knew it was nonsense. But that look on her face when I was at the university, and she said, and even though I knew it was nonsense, she said, nonetheless, she felt the kind of way that she understood it on some level. And that same words almost were told me a year or so later by a woman and her daughter, who had been there at the death of the woman's husband and the young woman's father, and that he had talked nonsense. But they said that same thing, that they kind of understood in this way. But this is something I've heard a lot of times, but those ones that I remember stick out.
So what do you think that is, as people are passing with nonsense? Do you think they're speaking a language that's logical in another dimension, as I don't, or what are your thoughts?
What I think is that it makes sense that when somebody would cross from one dimension of reality to some other dimension of reality, that they would talk nonsense about it. It makes perfect sense to me. For example, you remember those pictures that MC Escher did, like of the watermill, or the monk-like figures going around a staircase?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Right. And when you follow one monk, he goes up the staircase, turns a right angle, goes up the next staircase, another right angle, gets up the next staircase, then up the next staircase, and then ends up right at the same place.
Right.
And or the water mill, the water goes over the water wheel and then down into the trough, and then into another trough, and then over the water wheel again, right? And it makes sense to me that when you went from one dimension of reality to some other dimension of reality, you would be forced to talk nonsense about it. But
right.
Liz, the thing about it to me that is amazing, that the shamans knew all about this, and they used it the other way, because what shaman songs were specifically designed to take your mind over to the other side. And I mean, this is a long story, which I mean, it gets into things that are so sensational, but that nonetheless happens. But that to get to the sensational part, you have to go through a long discipline process. But basically, a shaman song consisted of elements of nonsense syllables and meaningless refrains. What is a meaningless refrain? Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock struck one, and down it ran. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock is the nonsense refrain, right? It's repeated at different. And so shaman songs consisted of nonsense syllables together with meaningless refrains, counterbalanced with elements of meaningful language, so that when you combine them together, the combination is more powerful than either one by itself. Right. And so, and this sounds so bizarre until you think of doo-wop music. And you're too young to remember, but shana na 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 na, shana na na na, get a job, right?
I heard the song, yeah.
Okay, right. And so
Yeah.
doo-wop music consists of nonsense as the main line or the harmony, together with meaningful parts. And when I was a professor of philosophy back 69 to 72, I had a little portable record player and a stack of doo-wop songs. And I would illustrate this to my students in my nonsense classes, how the combination of the nonsense and the meaningful parts is what gives the power to it. And you could quickly see once you do this that the different patterns and geometries have different effects. Like there was one called Little Star, and you could tell that the students would just, when you played this, because I was standing at the front, right, the students just go right into a trance because of the combination of those elements. And so what the shaman songs, and what they would say, we pass over to the spirit world by the power of our songs. And that sounds so romantic. And there's a kind of new age romanticization of shamans, which makes it something very mysterious. But in reality, this works because I've tried it myself. But, you know, the difficulty is then you get into things quickly that are so sensational. And then you draw in people who are not interested in the effort part of it. They want it now, you know, but it's because it's sensational. But it really requires a lot of, and this should not be anything odd to think about, because in our society, it's the Christian fundamentalists who have the glossolalia. And glossolalia consists of nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own native language, put together in a way to avoid meaningful combinations or grammatical structure. And so, anybody can do it. You don't have to be in a religious service. But once you, and you don't need to be in an ecstatic state to do it. But once you get it started and just get it on automatic, you do enter into quite a, you know, an astonishing altered state of consciousness, which, having been there myself, I can easily imagine that somebody in that state would be more receptive to God. You know, maybe it would be a good way of meeting God. And then in the koans, right? What is the sound of not of one hand clapping is a nonsense question. Well, it's demonstrable that if you ask people nonsense questions, what they tend to do is they tend to think of it as something intelligible, and they try their best to make sense of it and to answer it. But then that can quickly lead them into, you know, one thing I observed back in the 80s with my research is that when you talk nonsense to people in a very confident way, without letting them know that you're doing it, just to start doing it, it precipitates a situation where they will talk nonsense back to you, but they don't know that you're doing it. And it's easily demonstrable, as his friend of mine in intelligence was saying, that he and his friends, after my lecture, they went into a Starbucks, I think, and they found that it worked. But then why it works, that's a different question. I don't know. But
What's
you
an
can,
example of that? I can't even picture. Like, I feel like if someone spoke nonsense to me, I'd look at them
well,
and be like,
it's like,
what?
well, the first one I was where I did was that one I told you was I was at a cocktail party, and which I hated, but it's like a faculty thing, and I'm not good at those things. So, and I didn't know what to say. So this one day I had rehearsed this thing to say. I said, well, holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. And people just without a beat, like one woman said, I've always thought so myself. Right. And so but it's the wildest thing. And we had an assistant one time who was very straight, like, or not straight laced, but tight in her mental process. And I just read a single nonsense sentence to her, and it spun her right into it. I mean, you can do it yourself. You got to be confident about it. You got to do it like with pizzazz.
Do you think it's that people then like translate it and fill in into what they think it is? Are they being polite and trying to engage, or does they?
It's a mystery, but it's like it's sometimes it's very dramatic. They just spin out and they splutter, right?
Mhm.
But it's the sad thing about the fact that Aristotle forbade us to think logically about nonsense is that it has closed down faculties of our minds that could be very useful to us. And I
Mm.
mean, that's the opinion of so many of my students over such a long period of time about the way that it played out in their lives, and their creativity was in,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. So much
But it's funny,
imagination.
but it's, you see, the common sense thinks that if this is the level here of ordinary meaningful language, right? The common sense view is that nonsense is something down here, right? That
Mhm.
it just doesn't make it up. But that is, once you think it through, you quickly see that that's the exact reverse.
Mhm.
That nonsense is something built up on the top of ordinary meaningful language by a very simple formula. There's an infinite number of different types, but it's all of the types have one structural formula in common, which is that each type of nonsense follows some of the rules of language, but breaks other rules of language so that the outcome is unintelligible. And it's a simple formula. But what that means is that your mind is operating in a more complex modality when you're thinking of that, right? Because when you're thinking of an ordinary meaningful expression, all you have to pay attention to is the meaning rules. But when you're analyzing a piece of nonsense, you got to think not just about the rules that it's following, but also the rules that it breaks. And that is why you can, I mean, it sounds sensational maybe, but anybody who wants to try this for themselves can just get a group of people together and get them to write different patterns of nonsense and see what they think. But what my students have always told me is that it opens up parts of their mind that they didn't know they had.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm going to try it. And it must be innate to us because that must be how language started in the first
Yeah,
place.
this goes so far back, and you know, there is a mystery to it. A student of mine who was from China once said, "How do you know the nonsense didn't come first?" And that's a very interesting question. Was it at first just meaningless, blah, 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 which then, but I don't know. But the way it is now, you have to think of it analytically, which is that the nonsense is actually a secondary accrual. Because nonsense, paradoxically as it seems, is not just rule following, it's kind of more complex rule following. that ordinary meaningful language, because you got to think of the rules that it breaks along with the rules that it follows.
Yeah. And how do you know maybe some people who are like downloading nonsense maybe are downloading a language that's was an
Yeah,
ancient language or
it's, and also
you
all
just don't
kinds of
know, which is
implications, because one thing since I've been an amateur astronomer since I was 8, and just fascinated by astronomy since I was, and I just really think about in terms of the first communications from alien intelligence would be very likely to seem nonsensical to us, I would think.
sure.
Yeah. But a knowledge of how nonsense works might well be a part of cracking the code of some, to us, unintelligible language.
Yeah. Yeah. And words, I guess you've already explained that about watch a movie on your phone, but just words in general that were unknown, Google, that was a nonsense word, I guess, 100 years
Yeah,
ago. You sounded crazy if you said it from, or,
there's that one is in my book, actually, on figures of
oh,
speech. Yeah, I have this new book, Swan Song, which is it's coming out piece by piece, because I bet you're the same way as me, is that since I'm all into my work, I can't think about money very well. So that means I'm always short of money to do my work.
I'm
But
trying
it's
to
not,
change that, but I do really,
yeah, well, I'm
yes.
sure you do. It's creativity is a great blessing because it's the greatest high.
It
And
is.
also it makes practical like difficult many times.
It does. It's really unfortunate our world's not more rewarding of it as a value.
It
So,
is, it is, it is. And all
yeah.
of us starving artists feel that way. But
Hmm.
then,
Yeah.
we all imagine that we're like
Mhm.
Michelangelo or whichever one it was, that didn't
Right.
do well financially. But it's
Right.
all right.
Well, I would ask you, do you have a little more time or a little over an hour?
I
Or
absolutely do, but I already sell Amway products, if that's kind of what you're asking. I'm just making it. And you're probably too young to remember what Amway is too.
no, I actually know because I listened to some
I,
podcasts on multi-level marketing and how it's
all
kind of a
right.
scam, no
Yeah.
disrespect of it, but yeah, and they did a whole thing on
Yeah.
like Amway scamming people. So it's
Yeah.
very interesting. So I do know what it is, but yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I guess because this really at this point with amount of kind of as you touched upon is more of a philosophical question because we don't have facts or evidence. How would you imagine an afterlife works?
You know something? Honest to goodness, I give up. And
You
what
give
I
up.
think is, I think that probably that there is some hidden factor, right, that blocks our rational comprehension of that from this state of existence. Probably for the purpose, if I had to guess, of making a good movie. Because where I have come to is that what I think is going on is we're watching movies. And this has been an analogy or an allegory. This goes way back. Plato said, imagine like a cave where people are constrained so they only see the back wall of the cave. And behind them, there's a platform with a fire on it and a low wall in front of the fire so that attendants come by and hold up objects over the wall. And the fire casts the shadows of the objects on the back wall. And so, he's describing the situation. And so one of his interlocutors, Socrates is saying all this, but one of the guys talking to Socrates says, a very strange image and strange prisoners, Socrates. Socrates says, like to us, and what he's saying is that this is like an entertainment, right? That because the Greeks had obviously, oddly, you could go into a theater and enjoy a great show in Greece, but it was shadow theaters that had puppets on a screen. And so that's why, and he's kind of getting back at Aristophanes, the comedian who made fun of philosophers, calling up the dead at these oracles of the dead. Because that's what the scene of the cave is the oracle of the dead, where these places where you went to, you could look into a cauldron, for example, the water was clear, and by torchlight and preparation, you could see the spirits of the deceased. And I've done it hundreds of times myself. It works. But anyway, in terms of that allegory, see, we are the people in the cave. And I figured that out long before I read Plato, because when I was a kid, I realized something was wrong with this. I mean, I can't be sure that this is not just like a projection, right? And so here I am at age 81, and this is what I think, that this is the movies, right? And that what sort of tipped me over to that was a year I spent in geriatric psychiatry. I was about 30 years old, I guess. But because I was the oldest resident, having been through a PhD in philosophy, and also because I was known for my work, and I was it. For a year, I got to be in the VIP clinic, because every little town where there's celebrities has to have a place where the mayor and the chief of police and celebrities can go and are not showing up at the front door of the mental health clinic. And so I was it for a year, and I got to talk with these very distinguished and often famous old people who were there. I quickly realized mostly because they were lonely, wanted somebody to talk to, or situational stress. And constantly I heard that, Raymond, the older I get, the more, when I look back at my life, I get this strange feeling that it's been like a movie, right? Or a script, or a play, or a novel. You have different words, but like the narrative aspect of life. And your consciousness is narrative, right? As soon as some new event happens to you, your mind just unfolds it into your continuing life story. And I really became aware of this as a forensic psychiatrist, because it's like what you realize is homicide is story. As paradoxical as that seems, it really is story. That's why people are watching the Discovery Channel all the time now about this, right? Because it's story. Homicide is, I used to figure out, when I was a forensic psychiatrist, one of the first things my professor asked me is, well, why are you interested in this, right? You've got to face yourself first. Why are you interested in homicide? And it was partly because I'm from a law enforcement family, but it was also because I realized gradually that homicide is so fascinating because of three things. Number one, everybody's thought of killing somebody, right?
Yeah.
Number two, it's story. It's always a dramatic story to it. And number three, because the cognitive side of it, which is that every homicide is unique. And also every one of them, once you talk to a couple hundred people, every one of them is unique, but also every one of them conforms to one or more common patterns. And that's the same experience I had as a stamp collector as a kid, right? I mean, it's like every stamp is like some in another forms a pattern, but every one of them is unique. And that's what hooks you on homicide, or is those three things. And so
what are the patterns? I'm so curious.
Oh my God, it's just amazing. Like one time I went to this is a long story too, but I just happened to be going to a police department to lecture. But on the way, the sheriff got called to a homicide scene. So we went there, and so what happened was this woman was killed on her porch, and with something that was there at the scene, left there at the scene, the guy got it. So, but just from that detail, I said, well, this is somebody about 18 to 19 years old, lives by himself, watches TV a lot or reads comic books, and is low in the birth order, doesn't have the vehicle, so he probably rides a bicycle or takes public transportation. And all of those things were true, but see, it's not magic. It's basically the FBI went into the over 200, I think it was, killers in prison and to great risk to themselves. These were cases where this crime scene was exquisitely documented. And so then just from the characteristics of the people they learned from the interview, they could match the crime scene with the, and that one is a fairly common one. This where the, and so, it turned out was right, but it's nothing magic. And everybody picks it up once you, like I talked to a lot of homicide detectives who were, since my brother was known to them and my uncle, I mean, it's a long story, but I had a lot of law enforcement connections in my family when I was a forensic psychiatrist. And so that eased my situation. And so a lot of the homicide detectives would say, Raymond, it's like after a few years of doing this, I got to where I could walk into a scene and they'll say that they see a little movie. It's just like a movie of what happened. Nothing psychic, but it's just from the, and I saw that somewhat myself when I was doing this law enforcement stuff was, it's like after they show you a dozen or a few dozen of these blood spatter scenes, it really, you do begin to see just in the pattern what happened. Just put it together. So it's nothing magic, but it sure does look magic if you haven't seen all those pictures, which some of them, there were two things that I just couldn't look at.
Yeah, I could imagine. And then I want to ask you, before we wrap up, have you had any personal experiences yourself? I know some researchers end up having them.
Well, I have had a lot of experiences in my life that are just seem to be from some other kind of in place. Mm-hmm. One was in terms of George Ritchie, my friend, as I mentioned, that I was there. I was there in utero when his experience happened. Right. 19, and then after that, George kept recurring, like popping up in my life. For example, in 1964, I was with my uncle Fairley, who was a legendary law enforcement officer, and he was taking me around in the county that he served, and in this place out in the middle of the country, we came across this old grist mill, and I immediately thought, what a wonderful place. I want to live in an old grist mill. For a few years thereafter, I looked all over Georgia found that they're few and far between, and the people who own them don't want to sell them. So I had given that up. In 1989, I needed a new place out of the country to do my work on psychomantions. It needed to be in a place out of the country. So I looked all around the place I was living in Carrollton, Georgia. And the real estate was out of sight. I couldn't afford it, right? So the psychology department lady, secretary, in November of 1989 said, Raymond, if you just go right across the state line into Alabama, 11 miles, she said, the real estate over there is, you said, you'll be able to find a place. So I have no sense of direction. So I called a friend of mine who was a real estate agent in Atlanta and who was from Alabama. Robin, can you take me over to Alabama to find me a house? Never said a thing about an old mill. Okay, I had given that up. In January of 1990, she called me. Raymond, can you go over to Alabama tomorrow? Sure. She knows, and I have no sense of direction, right? So my only criterion is had to be close enough to the state line where I could get back and forth to my teaching 3 days a week, right? So anyway, the place we ended up going in, and the local sheriff took us around. He was a friend of her son's, and he had read my book. So, and I found this beautiful little Victorian cottage. It had a for sale sign on it. And so the sheriff said, "Oh yeah, that's the real estate agent on the sign was Kirk Moore, who was a friend of the sheriff's. So let's go into his office right now. So how are you?" And so, yeah, I'm Raymond Moody. He said, I'm, and I said, "I'm interested in that Victorian cottage you have for sale." "Well, what are you looking for?" Again, nothing about an old mill. I said, "Well, I'm looking for a place out in the country to do some research and writing. I'm a psychiatrist, right? Let me take you by a place near where I live. Cross an old bridge to an old grist mill." Am I dreaming? What? All right. So he said, "Well, and this, there was no cell phones. Okay. So he had to drive right back to his office. And he said, "Well, it's not for sale, but the reason I'm showing it to you is that the grown children of the couple who live in it or go to my church, and a couple of days ago, they had asked him to help them ease their parents away from the grist mill. And the parents were resisting, right? And so they had asked him gently to intervene. So he went back and called Miss Dorr and my president. "Miss Dorr, can I bring the man out?" "You can, Kurt, but we're not going to sell our house." And, you know, I knew it's like having lived there, is people would want to come see it all the time. That's probably what was in her mind. So anyway, back into the house, and shook hands with Miss Dorr. Raymond, I'm Raymond Moody. "Raymond Moody, Raymond Moody, are you the man that wrote that book?" She took me to the bookcase and got George Ritchie's book out, to which I had read the foreword, and said, as she opened it, to show me the inscription from George, she said, "Well, Dr. George Ritchie is one of our dear, dear friends.
No
This
way.
must be a sign." And that is how I ended up at that grist mill. 3 years later, George came to that. He had been to that house many times, but 3 years later, he came for my wedding.
Amazing. Oh,
Mhm.
well, just such a wealth of knowledge. I wish I could talk all day. I could talk
Well,
another 10
likewise, this
hours,
is
but
really fun. That's
this
great.
was so fun. I
Yeah.
gotta get going. And lastly, tell our listeners where they can find you, follow you. When is your nonsense book coming out? Last I understood it was just in French. It's not in English yet. Am I right? Or
Oh, that one is one I did some years ago, which is different.
oh,
This new one is called Swan Song,
and it's
and
oh, okay,
it's
perfect.
now in the process of being typed, actually, and it's all done. I finished it, but it's it's I don't feel like I wrote it, Liz. I mean, you know, I learned all that
Yeah,
stuff, but I just felt like it was dictated to me. But we'll see what
yeah,
happens. Right.
I can relate. Okay, so where can they find you? What's your website? Or
Oh, it's called lifeafterlife.com.
and I'll put it in the show notes. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Dr.
much.
Moody. I so
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yes, this is just delightful. So, and
Thanks.
thanks so much to all the folks listening in too.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, Reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?